On August 3, 1795, a scorching haze hung over the palisade of Fort Greenville. The air was thick and heavy, permeated with the smells of campfire smoke, rawhide, and anxious anticipation. Here, in the heart of vast forests that would soon be called the state of Ohio, an unprecedented force had gathered. More than 1,100 representatives of 12 different Indian nations had set up their camps around the American fortification. Among them were proud Shawnee chiefs, wise Miami elders, stern Delaware and Wyandot warriors. All of them had come here not of their own free will, but under the pressure of an inexorable, iron necessity. At the center of this gathering, like an axis around which the history of the continent revolved, was a man whom the Indians respectfully and fearfully called Black Snake, General Anthony Wayne. The scene unfolding in those August days was not merely a diplomatic assembly, but the final act of a tragedy that had lasted decades. The eyes of those present were fixed on the large council house where the fate of lands, equal in size to many European kingdoms, was being decided. In the silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the crackle of logs in the hearth, it was being determined where that invisible but fateful line would be drawn, separating the world of the past from the world of the future. Chief Little Turtle, whose wisdom was legendary among the tribes, looked at the spread-out maps and understood that the pen in General Wayne's hand now weighed more than 1,000 muskets. This was a moment of truth, when the old world of forests and free winds was preparing to give way to the geometry of fields and straight roads. To understand the full weight of the atmosphere that prevailed in Greenville that summer, it is necessary to rewind the thread of time a little and look at the events that led these proud peoples to the negotiating table. This was not a spontaneous decision. It was the finale of a long, exhausting struggle in which hope was replaced by despair and triumph by the bitterness of betrayal. Just a year earlier, in August 1794, the forest at the rapids of the Maumee River witnessed an event that changed the balance of power forever. The Battle of Fallen Timbers became the turning point when the military machine of the young American Republic proved its superiority over the tactics of forest ambushes. General Wayne, nicknamed __0__, for his audacity, but acting with the cold calculation of a mathematician, brought not a militia into these forests, but the Legion of the United States, the country's first professional army. He had trained his men for years, making them march, shoot, and, most importantly, not run at the sight of the enemy's painted faces. When the smoke of battle cleared, the seemingly invincible Indian Confederacy was forced to retreat. But it was not the defeat itself that broke the spirit of the warriors. The real blow was dealt not by an American bayonet, but by the locked gates of the British Fort Miami. The Indians, retreating under the pressure of Wayne's Legion, counted on the support of their longtime allies, the English. They fled to the fort's walls, expecting the gates to swing open and British cannons to cover their retreat. But the gates remained shut. The British commandant, fearing a new war with the United States, refused to let in his former allies. At the moment when the warriors were pounding on the fort's solid wooden gates and the steps of the approaching Americans could be heard behind them, something broke in the Confederacy's spirit. It was a betrayal that could not be forgotten. The realization that they were left alone against the advancing wave of settlers was a cold shower that extinguished the fire of resistance more effectively than any rain. Now, a year later in Greenville, they faced a choice that was not really a choice. General Wayne knew this. He understood the psychology of his opponents as well as he understood military strategy. He did not rush them. Negotiations lasted several weeks, from mid-June to early August. Wayne used time as a weapon. He hosted feasts, distributed gifts, delivered long speeches, demonstrating respect for traditions, yet steadily pushing his agenda. His goal was simple and brutal in its directness: to secure the borders and open the lands of Ohio for settlement. The outer layer of this conflict appeared as a dispute over borders and goods. The American government demanded the transfer of vast territories, most of modern-day Ohio, parts of Indiana, and the lands where the cities of Chicago and Detroit would later rise. In return, they offered goods worth $20,000 immediately and annual payments of $9,500. To a person accustomed to a market economy, this might seem like a deal. But when considering the scale, it was an exchange of an entire world for a set of blankets, kettles, and tools. Wayne, suffering from gout but always impeccably dressed in his blue uniform, sat at the head of the table, embodying inevitability. He read the terms of the treaty in a loud, confident voice, and each word lay as a heavy burden on the shoulders of the chiefs. The Americans demanded not only land, they demanded recognition of their sovereignty. The text of the treaty, which now lay before the chiefs, contained clauses that would forever deprive the tribes of the right to determine their own destiny without the knowledge of the Great Father, President Washington. It was a complex legal web, ensnaring peoples accustomed to living by the laws of honor and the spoken word. Wayne methodically outlined the new border, which would go down in history as the Greenville Treaty Line. This line began at the mouth of the Cuyahoga River, ran down the Tuscarawas River, then crossed the land to Fort Loramie, from there to Fort Recovery, and then directly south to the Ohio River, opposite the mouth of the Kentucky River. Everything east and south of this line now belonged to the United States, but behind the dry lines of geographical names lay a deep human drama, an internal conflict that tore apart the participants in the events. Chief Little Turtle of the Miami tribe was, perhaps, the most tragic figure of this assembly. He was a realist. He was the first to understand that resistance to Wayne's legion was futile even before the Battle of Fallen Timbers. He told his people that the Black Snake never sleeps, and that his warriors were as numerous as the leaves in the forest. Now, sitting opposite Wayne, he felt the bitterness of his correctness. He had to take responsibility for signing a document that many young warriors considered a disgrace. His internal struggle was the struggle of a father who must cut off an arm to save the body. He understood. If they did not sign now, the next war would lead to the complete disappearance of his people. On the other hand was Blue Jacket, the Shawnee chief. A warrior to the core, he led the Confederacy into battle, believing in the possibility of victory. For him, signing the treaty was an admission of the collapse of all his hopes. To see his lands, sacred hunting grounds, and ancestral burial sites handed over to strangers was agony comparable to physical torture. But he too saw the closed gates of the British fort. He knew that help would not come from anywhere. In his eyes was not submission, but the forced humility of a predator trapped in a cage. The inner world of these people was collapsing. They used to be masters of the forests, but now they were becoming petitioners, dependent on annual supplies of goods from the American government. It was a loss of identity, a transformation from free warriors into dependent children of the Great Father. Wayne also experienced his own internal conflict, though he hid it behind the mask of a stern commander. He was a soldier of the Revolution, a man of duty. He understood that he was making history, but probably deep down he also realized the injustice of what was happening. However, His loyalty belonged to the young nation that sought to establish itself in the world. He saw this treaty not as robbery, but as the establishment of order, the replacement of the chaos of border warfare with the structure of civilized, as it seemed to him, coexistence. For him, it was the culmination of a lifelong mission to ensure the security of his country, even if the price was the freedom of other peoples. But the deepest layer of this confrontation lay in the realm of ideas and philosophies. In Greenville, two fundamentally different worldviews clashed, two cosmogonies that could not coexist. For Americans, land was a resource, a commodity that could be measured, divided into squares, bought and sold. It had a price, expressed in dollars and cents. The entire philosophy of the young republic, later to be called Manifest Destiny, was built on the idea that westward expansion was the divine right and duty of a civilized nation. They brought with them the plow, the law, and writing, sincerely believing they were civilizing wild nature. Empty forests, from their perspective, were to be transformed into farms and cities. This was an inexorable march of progress that knew no pity for those who did not fit into its rhythm. For the Indians, however, land was not property. It was a mother, a living being that provided food and shelter, but which could not be owned. How could one sell the air or the flow of a river? The idea of drawing lines on a map was absurd and sacrilegious to them. They lived in a world where boundaries were defined by natural landmarks and agreements between people, not by entries in registry books. The Treaty of Greenville required them not just to cede territory, but to accept a foreign concept of world order. They had to agree that land could be alienated forever. This was a philosophical rupture, an acknowledgement that their ancient way of interacting with the world was doomed. The paradox was that the Americans, who proclaimed the ideals of freedom and equality in their Declaration of Independence, denied these rights to the indigenous inhabitants. They built their freedom at the expense of the freedom of others. In the council hall in Greenville, the ghost of this contradiction lingered. Wayne spoke of peace and friendship, but his argument was the bayonets of the Legion. He offered the protection of the United States, but this protection was a form of control. The Indians, in turn, faced the paradox of survival. To preserve themselves as a people, they had to give up what made them that people, their land and freedom of movement. The transformation of the situation occurred not at the moment of signing, but in the process of realizing the inevitable. At some point in the negotiations, amidst the smoke of peace pipes and endless translations from English to Algonquian languages and back, came the understanding that the old world was dead. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in consciousness. The chiefs realized that they no longer dictated terms. Previously, after victories over Generals Harmer and St. Clair, they could demand the Ohio River as a border. Now, they could only try to preserve something. Wayne masterfully used the tactic of divide and conquer, negotiating with individual tribes, breaking the Confederacy's unity. He convinced them that only direct relations with the United States could guarantee their security from encroachments by individual settlers and states. The climax came on August 3rd. The day was clear. The sun stood at its zenith, illuminating the bright uniforms of the officers and the colorful attire of the chiefs. On the table lay parchment, the Treaty of Greenville. One by one, the chiefs approached the table. The Wyandots, as keepers of the great wampum, signed first. Tarhe, the crane, said that he held this treaty in his hand on behalf of all nations. They were followed by the Delawares, Shawnee, Ottawa, Chippewa, Potawatomi, Miami, Kickapoo, and others. A total of 90 signatures and marks were affixed to the document. Little Turtle signed among the last, as if delaying this moment to the utmost. He spoke words that echoed through the ages. "I was the last to sign this treaty, and I will be the last to break it." In these words lay immense honor and infinite sorrow. The exchange of wampum, traditional shell belts symbolizing word and memory, sealed the deal according to Indian custom. But for the Americans, paper was more important. This document officially opened the floodgates for a stream of settlers. Ohio ceased to be Indian territory and became an American frontier. At this moment, as the ink dried on the parchment, the history of the independent Northwest ended, and the history of the U.S. Midwest began. The Indian War, which lasted 10 years, concluded not with a loud volley, but with the scratch of a pen. The resonance of this event is still felt today. The Treaty of Greenville became the prototype for hundreds of subsequent treaties that methodically pushed indigenous peoples further and further west, towards the setting sun sea. It set a precedent. Land could be acquired through a combination of military force and legal formalization. The principles laid down by Wayne and Washington in 1795 formed the basis of a policy that, decades later, would lead to the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears. The lesson of Greenville lies in the brutal truth of the clash of civilizations. When one culture, possessing technological and numerical superiority, confronts another, more traditional one, the law of force often masquerades as the force of law. The Treaty of Greenville showed that promises of eternal borders often last only until a new need for resources arises. The line drawn by Wayne was supposed to be a permanent boundary between whites and Indians, but not even 10 years passed before it was violated, shifted, and then completely erased by the greed of new settlers. Today, looking at a map of the Midwest, we see the cities of Cincinnati, Columbus, Chicago, standing on lands ceded on that hot August day. We drive on roads that follow ancient warrior trails. The names of rivers and lakes echo in the languages of those who were forced to leave. This echo of the past reminds us of the price paid for the creation of the modern state. Greenville is a lesson that progress is never free, and often its cost is paid with the fates of entire peoples. In the context of modernity, this story makes one ponder the nature of agreements and the power of the strong's word against the weak. The relevance of the theme has not faded. Issues concerning the rights of indigenous peoples, the preservation of their culture and lands, remain acute worldwide. Greenville was the beginning of a process that continues in various forms today. A process of struggle for identity in the face of globalization and unification. Mentally returning to that day, to the smoldering embers of bonfires at Fort Greenville, we see the participants of this historical drama disperse. Wayne's Legion celebrates a diplomatic victory that cemented military success. Settlers in the east pack their wagons, preparing to rush to new, rich lands. And the chiefs and their warriors retreat into the forests, carrying with them gifts that will soon wear out, and a treaty that will not save their children from new trials. They head west, towards the setting sun, and each step takes them further from their ancestors' graves. The fire in the hearth of the council house burns down, leaving only gray ash. This ash is a symbol of what remained of the former life after colliding with the relentless force of history. But even in ash, warmth persists. The memory of resistance, of the pride of people like Little Turtle and Blue Jacket, of the attempt to defend their world, lives on. It lives in names, in history, in the very land. The Treaty of Greenville marked the end of one chapter, but it also opened the next, a chapter of survival, adaptation, and the preservation of spirit against all odds. And this chapter is still being written. History abhors a vacuum, and the lands freed by the treaty immediately began to fill with new life, but according to different laws. Thousands of families moved west, believing in their right to happiness and prosperity, often without considering whose misfortune became the foundation of their well-being. This is the eternal paradox of human history, creation through destruction, the birth of a new world on the ruins of the old. And the Treaty of Greenville will forever remain a monument to this complex, painful, and majestic process, frozen in the pen strokes on old parchment in August of 1795. Thus ended the era of wars for the Old Northwest, and began the era of American expansion, an era that would change the face of the continent beyond recognition. But in the rustle of the Ohio cornfields and the sound of the wind over the Great Lakes, an attentive listener can still distinguish the voices of those who once called this land their only home. Their voices remind us that every land has a memory, and this memory is longer than the life of any empire. A treaty can redraw borders on paper, but it cannot redraw the connection of a person to the land that bore them. And perhaps this understanding is the most important legacy of the events that occurred at Fort Greenville more than 200 years ago.